Greetings. Glad you could all make it to the session. My name is Michael Downing, and I'll be chairing the panel today. Just a quick background on me. I've been studying the life and work of August Wilson since 1992, and I'm currently Associate Professor of English at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania, north of Philadelphia, where I work as I'm the webmaster of the August Wilson website, which is augustwilson.net, so there's my shameless plug, and the August Wilson blog, and the blog is actually quite active. There's quite a I dial into Google alerts and feeds and all this stuff on August Wilson, which then I put out there. If you're interested, you can find the sites simply by searching for August Wilson or August Wilson blog. The blog is quite active, as I mentioned. If you have anything to contribute, please contact me through email. My email address is all over those various sites. And let me get it pulled myself. In addition, I'm a guest editor of this year's Making Connections journal, published annually by the Frederick Douglass Institute. The subject of this year's journal is August Wilson. Deadline for submissions is June 30th, and I have a handout here if any of you are interested in that after the sessions. Activity relating to the life and work of August Wilson continues unabated. For example, theaters across the United States are producing Wilson's plays on a regular basis. We were just discussing before the session began. There was Ma Rainey's Black Autumn and Fences in London not too long ago. And I just posted an announcement on the blog for Ma Rainey at the Jubilee Theater in Fort Worth, Texas. In addition, the Green Space of New York City recently recorded all 10 of Wilson's Century Cycle plays using actors and directors familiar with his work. And a PBS documentary is in the works. Also, of course, the scholarship continues as manifested by the panel here at ALA. I'm thrilled to be chairing this. This is the second annual session. We began last year in Boston. It's the second annual session of the August Wilson Society through the American Literature Association. And we hope to maintain our momentum. We'll be back in Boston next year. I saw in the back of the program that if you're looking for that, May 27th through the 30th, 2015, at the Westin Coffee in Boston. Today, I'm delighted to offer 4 speakers. Sandra Shannon, who will make some brief remarks of Howard University. Then we'll move into the session proper with Elizabeth Pittman, Anthony Pennino, and Jacqueline Zeff. Sandra Shannon of Howard University is a celebrated Wilson scholar and the author of at least 2 books on August Wilson, The Dramatic Vision of August Wilson and August Wilson's Fences, a reference guide. She has also published numerous articles on August Wilson and is a frequent guest speaker. She and I have worked together on a number of recent projects related to August Wilson, but I'll let her reveal the details of those collaborations and anything else she would like to share. Sandra?
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Downing for his efforts in establishing the August Wilson Society. This is so very much needed. And my remarks today basically have to do with all of the things that are going on to preserve Wilson's legacy. What comes to mind most immediately, as you referenced, Michael, is that PBS, the NEH-funded PBS American Masters documentary of August Wilson's life, which is almost completed and is set to air in September. PBS American Masters. I serve as a consultant, along with my colleague, Dr. Ellen Nadell, consultant for WQED, and as well as the noted filmmaker Sam Pollack collaborating on that project. I want also to say, and you heard it first here, that in terms of extending the legacy of August Wilson beyond the documentary, not to minimize the documentary's importance, but it's events like this, but also Pittsburgh, many of the funders, and of course, the elephant in the room, of course, is that the center didn't do so well, okay? The August Wilson Center in Pittsburgh didn't do so well. But there are still funders who very much believe in and support and agree as we do that the legacy of August Wilson should be cherished and preserved. So toward that end, I am part of a grant writing team to establish an August Wilson Institute. This is part of the marketing plan after the documentary. So we're not just going to do the documentary and that's it. But we are in the process of trying to continue the legacy of August Wilson in an institutionalized form. very mindful of the missteps of those who were in charge of the center. In addition, shameless plug day, I brought copies of my book, which has gone through several variations and now deemed by Howard University Press to be a classic work. I'm so happy, as we were talking, that in any major city, just about any major city, there is an August Wilson play running. That's just how popular, not just popular, but how significant the material that he wrote about. I am very much looking forward to the papers. Pay no attention to me and Alan over here in the corner. I'm going to jot down notes. And I also want to say, finally, that I am in the process of editing 2 collections. One is farther along than the other. One is the MLA Approaches series, Approaches to Teaching the Plays of August Wilson. That has finally left my hands now and is now in the hands of the acquisition editor. And I'm praying that it sees the light of publication before this year ends. Secondly, I'm editing a collection called The Truth We Hold, The Truth We Wrestle, something along those lines. New critical perspectives on the plays of August Wilson. So I have my recruiting hat on as well, because there's room for a couple more essays in that collection. But as you hear, the work is ongoing. There's much to be done. By no means has everything been said or written or learned about August Wilson. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth Pittman joins us from George Washington University. Her paper is titled Rocking the Boat, The Value of Revolutionary Black Masculinity and Critiquing Neoliberal Capitalism in Gem of the Ocean and Radio Golf. Elizabeth has also published previously on Wilson with a paper titled Voicing the Law of the Sea, Commemoration and Cultural Nationalism in August Wilson's Gem of the Ocean. Elizabeth.
Hello, thank you. I'll begin. As preeminent Wilson scholar Sandra Shannon explains, Gem of the Ocean and Radio Golf are bound thematically and genealogically as the bookend plays of the 20th century cycle, representing its first and last decade respectively. As both the first and final plays, as well as the last plays Wilson wrote, their closeness not only reveals his philosophical approach to temporality, that the past is always present, to use Barry Elam's formulation, but audiences witness the establishment of revolutionary space and the ongoing struggle to protect it. How might 1839 Wiley Avenue on Esther's home be understood not just as the site for revolutionary historical consciousness and the collectivity it brings about, but the home as an analog to the work of the theater itself in a time of increasing disenfranchisement, as a thematic pushback against what Lisa Dugan terms the cultural politics of neoliberalism, or the culture wars, that played out in the contemporary public sphere. For Wilson, the theatrical sphere, the performances he envisions, used the counterculture of the blues and proposed Black Atlantic temporality to commemorate loss and provide alternative modes of spiritual sustenance. In a realm, the theater itself is a realm of dissent, of contending with the imbrication of cultural values and democracy, with the increasing shrinkage of the possibilities of life under neoliberalism to the dominance of wealth as the sign of viable life. Through explorations of freedom and unethical applications of the law, Wilson dramatizes the transformation from individual self-protection to an outward communal consciousness within the Hill District, as epitomized by Aunt Esther, Solly Two Kings, Elder Joe Barlow, Sterling Johnson, and experienced by Citizen Barlow and Harmon Books. Gem and Radio Golf might be understood as a critique of what Dugan sees as neoliberalism's, quote, key terms, privatization and personal responsibility, end quote, which for her, quote, define the central intersections between the culture of neoliberalism and its economic vision in the U.S. and abroad, quote. I suggest we must attend more closely to the relationship between property, Black masculinity, value, and social uplift, or revolutionary consciousness, that resists assimilation into the understanding of wealth motivated by a capitalist worldview. The physical house as property can also be read as a sign for the nation, which I said earlier, in which home ownership represents not only a financial boon, but increasingly an imperative of civic responsibility of U.S. citizenship. The revolutionary history of 1839 Wiley Avenue cannot be overlooked in that the address itself is the year, references the year of the Amistad Revolt. So the home itself is a memorial to the transatlantic slave trade, but the mutiny, the mutinies that occurred in the slave trade. Jim and Radio Golf enact the individual transformation of central characters, men for whom self-protection has been a matter of necessity. Citizen Barlow arrives at Aunt Esther's house because his self-protecting lie has caused another man's death. Whereas Harmon Wilkes works to carry on a business he inherited from his father and great-grandfather before him that ensures prosperity rather than communal engagement. Through the dramatization of Citizen Barlow's imaginative journey to the City of Bones, through Solly's mission to rescue his sister and destroy the mill that has exploited black workers, through Harmon's crisis over ownership of 1839 Wiley Avenue, and the injustice of property law, Wilson stages Black Revolution. So I'm actually going to spend most of my time here discussing the nature of value in Gem of the Ocean, particularly around the Aunt Esther's Bill of Sale and Caesar Wilkes's interpretation of it. As my title suggests, each play gestures toward a deeper historical frame, and as such, the ship is both a vehicle of captivity and a sign of freedom. Moreover, colloquially, the boat represents social or systemic and economic structures that maintain power relations and racial hierarchies in everyday life and politics. Rocking the boat for Citizen and Solly equates to a heroic disruption of the ways in which black men's labor is perceived and policed. Here I offer a brief reading of Value in Gem of the Ocean, focusing on the play's argument that 20th century capitalism continues the corrupt system that attributed monetary values to human beings in the Atlantic slave trade. You need to talk a little quieter now that the AC has. Mastering the tyranny of the ship's spatial logics upon the body is nowhere more fundamentally enacted than with Aunt Esther's Bill of Sale, which is folded and transformed into a paper boat by Esther herself and given to Citizen to hold throughout his journey to the City of Bones. A stage direction tells readers, quote, Aunt Esther has made a small boat from her document of a bill of sale, end quote. Wilson establishes a connection between self-value and economic systems of valuation and capital. Here, the bill of sale, a perverse contract that legalizes a monetary transaction, in this case in which money is either exchanged for freedom or money is exchanged between a seller and purchaser to ensure continued captivity, is claimed by its owner, transformed into a new vehicle of meaning, and transferred to another human being. As she passes on her, quote, Gem of the Ocean, end quote, Citizen, she notes that this piece of paper is, quote, not what you call your ordinary boat, but a magic boat that possesses power. However, in the act of renaming her bill of sale, she alters the power it possesses. No longer the sign of her freedom, the bill of sale contains another form of capital as Citizen grasps it throughout his journey to the City of Bones. Wilson's title directly references a slave ship, which Esther reveals in the second act, but it also refers to Esther's bill of sale. Gem suggests value attributed to rare and matchable qualities. Esther's bill of sale, however, stripped her of her person, making her an anonymous, quote, Negro slave girl, end quote, whose price of $607 ensures her to be, quote, sound and healthy, end quote. Value is resignified by Aunt Esther and consigned to the freedom from self-hatred Citizen achieves in her transference of the bill of sale to the imaginative boat. In a brilliant move, Wilson has Caesar, the capitalist, read Aunt Esther's bill of sale out loud in the parlor and for the audience. After Black Mary hands her brother the paper boat, he reads from the legal document that sanctions the transfer of Aunt Esther's person from one master to the state of William J. Osborne of the county of Guilford, state of North Carolina, to Isaac Thatcher. When he is done reading, Esther affirms that the Negro slave girl it records is her. Quote, that's a bill of sale for Esther Tyler, that's me, end quote. But she turns the appraisal of both the document and her person over to Caesar, demanding, quote, now you tell me how much it's worth, Mr. Caesar, end quote. His response demonstrates his failure to understand the import of this trial. Quote, "I wouldn't give you 10 cents for it," he says, still misrecognizing that the application of monetary amounts to human life is fundamentally a corruption of that life, and that the system that gave birth to this paper boat continues to perpetuate this false logic. Caesar demonstrates that as a, quote, "custodian of the law," he fails to understand the ways the past continue to structure the present. As the scene continues, Esther defends her home against Caesar's false god and upholding Pennsylvania law, urging him to see that 1839 Raleigh Avenue is, quote, "a house of sanctuary," and therefore a sacred place. However, Caesar's Bible is the Pennsylvania Penal Code, which he proceeds to read from as his protection and justification to arrest Solly for arson and Esther Tyler for, quote, "interfering with the administration of justice and aiding and abetting the fugitives." In this final scene, private law clashes with public or state law. Jim of the Ocean presents a powerful reading of the intersection of blackness and value in the 21st century, read through the struggles over property and its protection in Great Migration. I interpret this climactic dialogue in which Esther bears her most intimate history for Caesar as an intervention in contemporary discourses of domestic economic policy and the worth of black life under neoliberalism, which preserves and utilizes multiculturalism and diversity as signs of an institution's capaciousness. The remedy that Aunt Esther offers, historical consciousness, needs further interrogation as it is dispersed and suggested in this play through her body as a vessel for memory and investment. Yet Wilson's play proffers the history of black folk and the history of slavery as a contestatory methodology that shows up neoliberalism's dehumanizing organization of citizens into vectors of labor and profit, even as it functions as an ideology to obscure this outcome, which is made even more reality through the global and political domination of multinational corporate interests. According to Lisa Dugan, neoliberal policies grew directly out of conservative attacks on, quote, "downward redistribution of resources fought for and espoused by civil rights, black power, third world, and feminist revolutionaries of the 1960s and 70s in favor of, quote, "movement intent on building a culture of upward redistribution." Thus, the gains achieved through social dissent to re-engineer the social contract in favor of a state that dissenters profit from its national project were short-lived and failed in favor of economic and social policies that twinned free market capitalism with the very function of U.S. democracy. Caesar Wilkes applies criminality as a false label to those characters who are most heroic. Moreover, the rhetoric Wilkes employs to defend his rationale, such as protecting investments or the mills as well as the state's interests, echoes the public discourse used by the right and later the Clinton administration to implement the war on drugs and limit social services under the rubric of welfare policy. These discourses misapplied culpability and criminality. Wilson's plays, on the other hand, champion the blues and the men and women who created as spaces of resistance and as producers of exactly those values that ultimately undermine this violent rhetoric. In his remarkable book, Blackness and Value, Lyndon Barrett demonstrates the ways that value has been discursively attributed to whiteness and blackness in different ways in U.S. culture. He argues that African American musical forms and investment in the singing voice as a vehicle of expression offers competing formations of value to those of dominant U.S. culture, which understands itself as white. Esther's bill of sale translates the human into monetary value and simultaneously that monetary value into cultural value, or a representation of cultural value. By transferring the value of the legal document to a spiritual object for citizen, Esther negates the valuation, and the system of values developed through the monetization of black bodies. Barrett explains, if the material economic transaction produces racial blackness as a phenotypical and modifiable essence, the related transaction aims at producing blackness as a negative discursive, cultural, and psychological essence. And Lyndon Barrett argues that value is used to police and create and maintain borders. And I find this reading really illustrative and illuminating in terms of Wilson's work, which riffs on values in many different ways, cultural values, worth versus cost, the way value is assigned. So I'm still working through that reading of Barrett's understanding of value. Revolution in Jim of the Ocean is constituted through a respect for life over simply surviving or getting by, as we see with Garrett Brown's choice to drown rather than be arrested for theft, a crime he didn't commit, and is reiterated in Officer's words to Citizen once he has imaginably made the hellish crossing to the sea of bones. So live. Revolution is also constituted through acquiring historical consciousness and through a reconsideration of the ways in which life is valued.
Sure. Thank you so much.
In Radio Golf, I'll just say a couple things about Radio Golf. In Radio Golf, 1839 Guadalupe Avenue has lost its value. It's going to be raised by Harmon Wilkes, the descendant of Caesar Wilkes, redevelopment agency. As a real estate agent, he is planning to, in a way, rejuvenate the hill. There are two characters, Elder Joseph Barlow, descendant, and Sterling Johnson, who provide readings of the ways that the state functions in policing forms of value. So I'll read a quotation that Johnson, kind of as Harmon's teacher, as Harmon's guide in many ways. In contrast to Harmon, who has inherited his business and public position, Sterling states, quote, "I've been going through the back door all my life, but I now know how to row the boat. I've been on water a long time. I know what it takes to plug the holes paying dumb." He concludes, I had some money. It didn't make me smarter. It didn't make me better than anybody else. You can't do nothing with money but spend it. And so, as Johnson argues that money provides temporary relief, it does not provide him moral or spiritual sustenance. To conclude, I will say the century cycle constructs and perpetuates tenets of black cultural nationalism formulated in the 1960s and 1970s. However, Wilson translates cultural nationalism to a more capacious and possibly more amenable shape or message using what he sees as the promising ethics of American theater, and he explains these in the ground in which I stand. Harry Elam explains, quote, "Reimagining the paradigms of cultural nationalism, Wilson links the ground of the American theater with the ancestral ground of African-American labor, disease past unreparated efforts of his black forebears that foster his current claims and shape his rhetoric." Jim of the Ocean and Radio Golf exist in a dialogic relationship with each other, and their discussions of the ways monetary and social value have been attributed to the products of this labor, its invisibility, and the spaces of labor, as well as spiritual sustenance. Thank you.
Although it's tempting to go into questions right now, we're going to have questions to the end to ensure that our other speakers have time to deliver their papers. Tony Pennino is Assistant Professor of Literature and Theater Arts at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. He holds a PhD in drama from the University of London and an MFA in playwriting from Columbia University. His paper is titled "To Understand About That Piano, Property and Gender in August Wilson's The Piano Lesson."
Thank you. For a paper on August Wilson, I'm going to start a rather strange place, seemingly, going back to 1699 with John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, in which he writes, "Every man has a property in his own person. This no body has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left in it, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property." This fundamental position of Locke's would go on to inspire the founding fathers in the authoring of this nation, to such an extent that famously the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness were originally proposed as the rights to life, liberty, and property. Lockean ideals, property would be the very brick and mortar of the American dream. It is easy to understand the appeal when the political philosopher himself imagines the children of Adam or Noah planting, quote, "in some inland vacant places of America," end quote. For obvious reasons, the African American experience with these Lockean principles of property has been a complicated and a tortured history. Though every individual indeed has property of his or her own person, the institutions of slavery and Jim Crow certainly attempted to erase any idea of such a right with those held in chains. Following the Civil War, former slaves became extremely intent on owning land. Eric Foner, in his excellent The Story of American Freedom, examines the argument of Garrison Fraser, a black Baptist minister during Reconstruction, in his call for property. Foner reports, quote, "Genuine economic freedom," Fraser insisted, "can only be attained through ownership of land. For without land, blacks' labor would continue to be exploited by their former owners." End quotation. Ownership of land, therefore, becomes essential in escaping the horrors and history of slavery. Toni Morrison, for instance, in her novel The Bluest Eye, draws a clear distinction between the racketeers who own their own home and the breedloves who rent. One of the worst things that can happen to an individual in this novel, set in the 1940s Lorain, Ohio, is to be put outdoors, or to be deprived of a home, of a place to live, of a place to call one's own. It should come as no surprise that this idea of the importance of property, which in general is central to the American drama, such as the living newspapers 1/3 of the nation, should hold such a pivotal role on the African-American stage. My larger research project investigates how the Lockean paradigm of property informs 20th century African-American drama. As can be imagined, the spectrum of responses is quite broad. The ownership of property can be a salvation or a curse. A character may open a new door to the future, or be haunted relentlessly by the past. A year ago, I spoke at a conference in Boston where I discussed Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, as well as two plays, both flawed, that were in conversation with that work: Bruce Norris's Clyburn Park and Kirsten Greenwich's Luck of the Irish. With the younger clan, of course, we witnessed the struggles this family encounters as it makes its move from renting in inner city Chicago to owning a house in the suburbs. Last month, I spoke at the NAMLA in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on James Baldwin's Pittman Corner. Here, Sister Margaret and her son both seek new paths apart from the attachments of property. Baldwin eschews property and demonstrates through his narrative that ownership of the self needs no tangible ownership of property as an anchor. In so doing, Baldwin is not demanding a place at the table of American society, not surprising from a writer who chose an expatriate life in Paris. He finds through David, and touching on the autobiographical, another avenue to a sense of self-fulfillment, through the very specific and individual needs of the soul that can be only answered through art. Today, I turn my attention to August Wilson's Piano Lesson, a particularly important play in my research for a number of reasons, but in no small part because of the rich history the playwright builds for the Charles family. As a side note, I had the great fortune of being a member of the audience for the revival stage at New York's Signature Theater, which stands as a vital and passionate production of this seminal play. Set during the Great Depression, the Piano Lesson serves as an excellent crucible by which issues of property, as conceived by Locke and inculcated by the African-American community, can be assessed. With this play in particular, we can determine that assessment through the lens of gender. Certainly, gender plays a significant function in A Raisin in the Sun. The more domesticated space of the house, favored by the younger women, ultimately it has greater value than the more commercial space of the liquor store, ultimately favored by Walter. But with Williamson's opus, gender lines define and illustrate the Manichaean opposition on the subject of property. The chief contenders in that opposition are Boy Willie and his sister Bernice. Let's begin with Boy Willie. Much like Fraser, as reported by Foner, Boy Willie associates property with freedom. Not just economic freedom, but personal freedom as well. Wilson renders Boy Willie's drive to purchase land all the more poignant because it is owned by the Slitters, the former masters of Charles family. As a character, Boy Willie has fully inculcated Lockean notions of property, and therefore, understandably, believes that the ownership of property will help erase the bleak history of his family. He enters the play in the middle of the night like a hurricane, announcing the death of Sutter. Additionally, he has the opportunity to purchase Sutter's land, opportunity he only pursue if he sells the family piano currently in Bernice's possession, but of which they each own half. Boy Willie tells his Uncle Joker, quote, "That's why I come up here. Sell them watermelons. Get Bernice to sell that piano. Put them 2 parts with the part I done saved. Walk in there. Tip my hat. Lay my money down on the table. Get my deed and walk out. This time I get to keep all the cotton. Hire me some men to work for me. Gin my cotton. Get my seed. And I'll see you again next year." End of quote. Boy Willie's objective clearly fits within a Lockean paradigm. From his point of view, he and his family have mixed their labor with the state of nature that is Sutter's land, and have joined something that is their own, thereby making it his, White Willie's property. As such, this objective finds a comfortable place within the construct of the American dream. White Willie demonstrates throughout that his is an entrepreneurial spirit, from his negotiations with Sutter's brother to his hope of hiring them himself in the future, an argument we should not ignore, to his rather material view of the piano as just an object of barter, one piece of property to exchange for an even greater one. Bernice's position is diametrically opposed to that of her brother's. She states during one of their frequent arguments, quote, "Money can't buy what that piano cost. You can't sell your soul for money. It won't go with the buyer. It'll shrivel and shrink to know that you ain't take onto it, but it won't go with the buyer." End quotation. Clearly, Bernice's perspective with regard to the piano is outside of the material concerns of White Willie. Money and land, the means of transaction that form a locking ideal in the American dream, have no value for Bernice. And here, ownership of the self, the soul, is divorced from the physical, as Baldwin touched upon in that corner. The piano is more than just a musical instrument. It is a family heirloom, a work of art and history that depicts through carvings Boy Willie and Bernice's ancestors when they were slaves. Further, as Michael Morales notes in Ghost of the piano has strong similarities to, quote, devices used to preserve the oral history of several African civilizations, such as the memory boards, the casa of the Lupa, and the brass plaques of Benin, end quote. As important as the piano is to the Charles family, it touches on transformative events in the African American experience that transcend any one individual or family. Sell the piano is to sell a piece of history, both macro and micro levels. Here, Wilson demonstrates the strength of the theater as a medium to convey the richness, complexity, devastation of the African American experience. As a set piece and therefore physically central on stage, the piano becomes invested with the past that Bernice, Doker, and other characters describe. The audience begins to have empathy with the piano as a character and finds it selling a violation on an emotional level, whereas on the page, you might reject the selling of the instrument purely from an intellectual position. As mentioned earlier, history occupies a preeminent position in this work. The detail with which Wilson attaches to the Charles family's backstory surely has to be one of the richest and most nuanced of the American stage, and subject to multiple interpretations. Winning Boy and Shades of the Iceman Cometh lives in a rosy past that holds a far greater allure than the present. Doker serves in part as the family oral historian, and often relates incidents of the past via story, via narrative. In the confrontation between Boy Willie and Bernice, it is how the family history is to be interpreted, often from the perspective of gender, that fuels their arguments. There is something quite Hegelian in that opposition, a tragedy born from the clash of two rights. Let's consider Boy Willie's case first. He argues, quote, "The only thing that makes that piano worth something is them carvings Papa Willie Boy put on there. That's what makes it worth something. That was my great-granddad. Papa Boy Charles brought that piano into the house. Now I'm supposed to build on what they left me. You can't do nothing with that piano sitting up here in that house. That's just like if I let the watermelon sit out there and rot. I'd be a fool. All right, now if you say to me, Boy Willie, I'm using that piano, I give out lessons on it, that helps me make my run or whatever, I'd go on and say, well, Bernice using that piano, she's building on it. Let her go on and use it. I gotta find another way to get Sutter's land. Well, note in particular how Boy Willie expresses his worldview here. He claims ownership of his male forebears. He only understands the piano in tangible, materialistic terms. It is something to be built upon. It is to be weighed on the scales of commerce with Sutter's land. And since Bernice has chosen not to utilize it in a material sense, then its worth is going to waste. Now let us consider Bernice's response. Well, look at that piano. Look at it. Mama Ola polished this piano with her tears for 17 years. For 17 years she rubbed on it till her hands bled. Then she rubbed the blood in, mixed it up with the rest of the blood on it. Every day that God breathed life into her body, she rubbed it clean and polished and prayed over it. Play something for me, Bernice. Play something for me, Bernice. Every day I clean it up for you. Play something for me, Bernice. You always talking about your daddy, but you ain't never stopped to look at what this foolishness cost your mama. 17 years worth of cold nights and an empty bed. End quotation. Like Boy Willie, Bernice attempts to wrest control of the family narrative. They, of course, look at the history through the lens of gender. Where Boy Willie sees only his male forebears, Bernice demands that attention be paid to their mother. Note to the description she employs, how Mama Ola's blood mixed with the wood of the instrument. Intentionally or not, Wilson invokes Locke's very language of mixing one's labor with nature. Though she eschews ownership of the physical, Bernice here is very much utilizing a Lockean image and laying claim to ownership of Charles' family history, and by extension, she argues that women have the stronger claim to such ownership. Wilson supports that claim in how he dramatizes the ending. Sutter's goes to Pierce. I think it extraordinarily important that the threat here is from a ghost, a phantasm of the past. Ghosts are meant to terrify, and of course Sutter represents the terrifying specter of slavery. Boy Willie attempts to fight the spirit physically to no avail. Avery attempts a Christian exorcism, again to no avail. It is only when Bernice begins to play the piano, thus summoning the ancestors, that Sutter's ghost is defeated. Throughout much of the play, Bernice refuses to touch the instrument. She explains to Avery, quote, "When my mama died, I shut the top on that piano, and I ain't never opened it since. It's only playing it for her. When my daddy died, it seemed like her life went into that piano. I don't play that piano because I don't want to wake them spirits." The critical moment of the play's climax, Bernice seeks protection from earlier generations of the Charles family, rather than merely serving as their protector. By play's end, both Boy Willie and Bernice have received a piano lesson. Boy Willie plans to return home without the piano in tow. He has abandoned his purely material calculation, at least as far as the piano is concerned. He has developed a new appreciation of the role of the piano as an important totem and a receptacle of the family's history, not just its stories, but its living spirit. Bernice has also grown over the course of the play. She treated the piano almost as a museum piece, something not to be sold, but also something to keep distant and untouched. Boy Willie wanted her to use that piano, but of course for him, use could only be as currency in exchange or as something to build upon. She does come to use the piano, but in a way that connects with her more fully and viscerally with all those who came before her. The past and present come to inform one another, respect one another, protect one another, and share with one another. This is thought is a particularly heartening one, as Wilson himself would craft a cycle of plays, building one decade upon another, as each work adds texture, support, and emotional resonance to its siblings. Throughout a cycle, Wilson explores, among other things, what ownership means for the African American community. Radio Golf, of course, is a prime example of that exploration. In the piano lesson, though, he untangles the thread of blocking ideals of property as expressed within the American hegemonic idiom. The purely materialistic aspects of that political philosophy are found wanting. However, through the conflict between Boy Willie and Bernice, Wilson discovers new, more spiritual possibilities for Locke's turns, both elevate the principle and help move his characters to action. In one sense, then, Wilson has taken ownership of Locke and reimagined it for the specific African American historical experience. As such, the piano lesson must occupy a prominent space in investigation of role property in the 20th century African American drama. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Jackie Zeff is Professor of English and Masters of Liberal Studies in American Culture, University of Michigan, Flint, where she has received the UM Flint University Faculty Achievement Award for Excellence in Teaching and the ACE Women in Leadership Award. The title of her paper is A Big Bend There, Tree by the Shore, Situated Identity in the Janitor.
In a 1999 interview for the Paris Review, August Wilson describes what drew him to dramatic form. Quote, "I think it was the ability of the theater to communicate ideas and extol virtues. And also I was and remain fascinated by the idea of an audience as a community of people who gather willingly to bear witness." To be sure, in his full-length plays, Wilson frequently offers witness testimony and witness communities on stage. But the assertion of that testimony as a way to create and reveal male agency is never more clearly dramatized than in his one-act play, for monologue it is not, The Janitor. As Wilson told Professor Shannon in their 1991 interview, when he was asked to write a 4-minute play as part of a fundraiser for new dramatists, of which he was a member, such a constraint proved a productive challenge, as Wilson explains, quote, "This was kind of difficult. How do you write a 4-minute play?" So I came up with the idea of a janitor who is someone the society ignores, and someone who may have some valuable information, someone who has a vital contribution to make, and yet you have relegated him to a position where they sweep the floor. And I look at how the Israelis are just absolutely delighted in the fact that they have close to 1 million Soviet Jews that are coming into the country, and they are looking forward to what those Soviet Jews have to contribute. This is a lot of intellectual power and intellectual potential that is coming into their country, and they're going to use that. And we're sitting here with 35 million blacks who have a lot of untapped potential. So there's the idea of not taking advantage of your potential. So I thought I'd show this guy here who is sweeping up the floor. And there's this microphone, and he just goes up and starts talking into the microphone. It is interesting to me that Wilson compares the experience of African Americans to those of Soviet Jews. For this is not the first nor the last time that Wilson finds metaphors and models from the Jewish historical experience. Perhaps in part because Wilson's childhood neighborhood in Pittsburgh was mostly a mixture of Syrians, Jews, and blacks. But also because Wilson found in the biblical and contemporary Jewish experience a narrative that resonates with his understanding of black history as what he calls a 400-year-old autobiography, with its attendant assault on African American culture, language, and space. In his 1988 interview with Bill Moyers, Wilson explores his definition of what's called African sensibilities by comparison to the Passover Seder, where the narrative of Jewish slavery and redemption is relived every year. Wilson recalls his first-hand experience of the Seder, quote, "A friend of mine invited me to Passover once, and I was struck by the very first words. It starts off, 'We were slaves in the land of Egypt.' That's the first thing. Next year in Jerusalem comes at the end. But they were constantly reminding themselves of what their historical situation had been. I find it criminal that after hundreds of years in bondage, we do not celebrate our Emancipation Proclamation, that we do not have a thing like the Passover, where we sit down and remind ourselves that we are African people, that we were slaves. Part of the problem is that we don't know who we are, and we're not willing to recognize the value of claiming that, even if there's a stigma attached to it." Wilson suggests to Moyers that the Juneteenth celebration, quote, "should be celebrated like the Jewish Passover wherever blacks find themselves," end quote. Of course, for Wilson, redemption comes not from miracles performed by an attentive deity, quote, "You're never saved by any outside force. It all comes from within you." Even one's connection to the divine is defined from within for Wilson. He observes in a 1990 interview with Vera Shepard, "Toledo and Ma Rainey says, we forgot the names of the gods. But I have a very simple viewpoint toward that. When you look in the mirror, you should see your God. If you don't, then you have somebody else's God." These lifelong concerns that infiltrate Wilson's interviews and plays explain in part his signature devotion to listening to his characters speak and lead him to create what he calls long speeches that are an unconscious rebellion against the notion that blacks do not have anything important to say. Mr. Collins reflects that viewpoint at the end of The Janitor when he urges Sam to quit wasting time and get this floor swept. There's going to be a big important meeting here this afternoon. But of course, Sam has said it all, as Wilson observes, quote, "They're going to get all these people at this conference to talk about youth, a conference on youth. And all these people with academic backgrounds and status are not going to say as much in all of their days of seminars and conferences as this man has said there in 5 minutes. And that was my idea of the play." Now this idea, of course, is an ironic background for our academic presentation at a literary conference, but by linking Sam's teachings to a conference on youth, Wilson invites us to consider what social and cultural factors contribute to the autonomy and integrity of the young learner, especially young black fellows. By applying what education researchers have described as situated identity, we may gain a fuller appreciation for Sam's rich imagery, narrative, and sense of self-worth as he testifies from his own lived experience to an audience yet to come. For, as Wilson explains, I try to position my characters so they're pointed to the future. In his article, Identity, Agency, and Culture, Black Achievement and Educational Attainment, Peter Morrell Jr. challenges the popular and, in his view, simplistic underpinnings of an achievement gap mindset in educational research and reform. Instead, Morrell offers a deeper interpretation of achievement or underachievement for African American learners that integrates the psychosocial development model formulated by Erik Erikson with what Morrell describes as situated identity for African American student learners, and I quote from Professor Morrell. Situated identity, in simple terms, means that our sense of self or identity is not a static, unitary entity, but is better thought of as being fluid and situationally expressed. In contrast to the psychological formulation of racial identity as a stable, staged entity, this framework posits racial identity formation as a process reflective of and situated in social and political historical struggles. Situated mediated identity theory enlarges on the psychobiosocial notions of Erikson's theory by focusing on identity as it is socially mediated and determined by our intentional action. Identity is mediated by culture as well as one's own agency. In the situated mediated framework, identity is our agency in activity. Who we are is constituted by what we choose to do and how we choose to invest that doing. Or, as Sam explains, what you are now ain't what you're going to become. For Morrell, and I would argue for Wilson's theater, an identity is a work in process, but can be mediated in predictable and positive ways if the social context of others is constructed and assembled in ways supported to development. Sam's speech is such a constructed context for his young listeners and offers them a very positive message that the uncertainties and challenges and even the mistakes they will make do not condemn their futures, which are theirs to control. It is revealing that the sign hanging across the ballroom says it will be a conference on youth, suggesting an audience of caregivers, teachers, or other professionals, whereas Sam imagines a conference where he speaks to youth. Morrell outlines 3 processes of social development essential to an authentic, situated identity: an intrapersonal identity, an interpersonal identity, and a transpersonal identity. In The Janitor, we can see Wilson's remarkably full-bodied vision of these processes. The intrapersonal identity development process is that of ego identity theorized by Erik Erikson. According to Erikson's theory, the adolescent must answer the question, who am I? Which can only be found when earlier conflicts in childhood are resolved and one feels independent, competent, and in control of one's life. Sam begins his speech by asserting his sense of self-worth and competence to address the topic of the day. I'm 56 years old, and I know something about youth. The first thing I know is that youth is sweet before flight, and its odor is rife with speculation, and its resilience, that's its bounce back, is remarkable. While readers are sometimes tempted to interpret the ellipses, for example, when Sam reads the banner aloud, as signs of his lack of literacy or confidence, I would argue that they underscore thoughtful pauses that reveal his determination to be precise and communicate clearly. He, in fact, explains the terms he is using, surely a sign of confidence and awareness of his audience. And Wilson's own stage direction notes that, quote, he chooses his ideas carefully. The interpersonal identity development process is that of interactional positioning, or footing, as theorized by Irving Goffman. In his examination of face-to-face interactions, Goffman posits that speech should be seen not as a linguistic, but as a social or dramaturgical act, whereby a speaker positions himself or herself through verbal and nonverbal signals suited to the context or situation. Sam explains himself by referring to one of the all-time situational experts, Iago. One of them fellows in that Shakespeare stuff said, "I am not what I am." See, he wasn't like Popeye, which I interpret to mean fixed in aspect, tone, and preference for spinach. Sam advocates and reassures his young audience that, quote, "You are just what you have been, whatever you are now. But what you are now ain't what you're going to become, even though it is with you now. It's inside you now this instant." Sam confesses that he has sometimes lost his footing. See, just like you forgot who I am, I forgot what happened first. But what is clear here, to me, is the transactional, interactive nature of this verbal event. The transpersonal identity development process developed by Morel offers a way for youth to gain, quote, "the agency to improvise their own expressions of self in dynamic interaction with others who may attempt to ascribe unwanted and ego-degrading projections to the individual." Sam's rich amalgamation of biblical, philosophical, literary metaphor are not the ramblings of an old man, but rather underscores his ability to improvise, to capture the fragments of truth and insight that are uniquely his, and to offer them to his audience, such as the river whose name he forgot, our hands in the soup, the music he plays, just so, the down payment on his troubles, Gabriel's horn. He acknowledges those forces that would degrade his understanding of the self, and, quote, "like everybody else, I have tried to fool them with my dancing and guess at their faces." The most compelling of these metaphors is what Sam names wrestling with Jacob's angel. Sam comes to this biblical story after proclaiming, "We are all victims of ourselves." And when the angel comes to wrestle at night, Sam teaches, you're bargaining for your future, see? And what you need to bargain with is that sweetness of youth. So, to the youth of the United States, I says, don't spend that sweetness too fast, because you're gonna need it. See, I's 56 years old, and I done found that out. One might even summarize these three processes using Wilson's own description of the tenets of black nationalism as, quote, self-determination, self-respect, and self-defense. If indeed identity is situated, then one must approach life as Wilson describes his janitor. Quote, "He is a man who approached life honestly, with both eyes open." Sam's speech-making process resonates with Wilson's description of his own artistic process. When asked by Kim Powers in 1984 if he writes from the audience's total perspective or from the viewpoint of each character, Wilson admits that, quote, "the characters actually do what they want to do, and the process can be terrifying. You're either wrestling with the devil or Jacob's angel. The whole purpose being that when you walk through that landscape, you're arriving at something larger than you had when you started. And this larger something should be illuminating and as close to the truth as you can understand." When Sam goes back to sweeping as the lights go down, we know that Wilson's dramatic purpose has been achieved, and in only 4 minutes.
We now turn toward the Q&A. Are there questions in that one?
Yeah, in trying to put Wilson, I think there's something one has to consider putting Wilson in a box like anti-neoliberalism. For example, one would have to deal with the very, very strong neoliberal strains in his work. Positions I don't personally agree with necessarily, but he was. You may know, or you may be interested in knowing, that he sided with Boy Willie. He said on paper that he should have sold the piano. Now, when I first saw that interview, I was just flabbergasted. But the point with Wilson is that in almost every one of his plays, you're going to find a valorized neoliberal involved with self-determination. And in fact, the power of Bernice's argument, it seems, comes out of, again, it seems, according to Wilson himself, was that he felt compelled to make her argument stronger because he was on the other side. And it's easy to fall into that trap of seeing the strong argument as describing a position he's taking instead of the way an ensemble works productively against one another. Or at least I would say if you're going to pursue those arguments, you might want to think about that.
Yeah, Tony had said a tragedy formed from the clash of two rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that teases it out very well.
Yeah, but I mean, but in working it out, for example, when you say, well, the exorcism didn't work, actually it did work. It's not, a lot of the criticism says, oh, morals are, it's the African rights that survive. No, without the exorcism, you don't call for the ghost. The ghost arrives because of the exorcism. Avery is valorized too. It's insufficient alone, but without Avery's exorcism, the ghost doesn't arrive. He calls forward the ghost so that Bernice can get rid of it. And that part is often overlooked, that Wilson is always looking, the minute he sees someone take a position, you'll even see it within his speeches, that he will take the other position. Characters seem in a very bizarre way to contradict themselves, and then not really, they're working through exactly that tension. So I'm not exactly disagreeing, but I think that stuff has to be, pushed through in a way that deals with the complications at work there. Maybe you disagree, I don't know.
Is there a question?
No, it was a comment. It was not a question. It was a comment as part of a dialogue.
Sure,
right. Yeah. Is there any response?
I mean, for me, that's really helpful because I've been struggling with trying to identify what I see as these kind of really powerful strategies for possibility for futurity, along with the strains of economic discourse. And yes, I totally agree with you that there are always these contending sides that you have to strain.
They just turn back on themselves
right.
all the time.
So cycles or loops.
Right.
But so that's very helpful for me to kind of follow one out and then follow out the other side as well. And where does that reading go?
I would say that I don't think, or what I even suggest, that he finds Boy Willie villainous or his reason, his rationale, lacking in perfectly understandable position that he's coming from. But there's something in, we always, when we talk in our classes, the author has a certain perspective, but that is a perspective, not the only one. And there's something when you see the thing on stage and the power of Bernice's argument, and particularly in the signature production, one cannot help as an audience member be overwhelmed by the stagecraft and the power that's being employed in that specific moment. I think he does. Boy Willie is not a bad guy, not a villainous guy, and I think perfectly understand the position. As you know, there is an Hegelian opposition at work here, but the stagecraft, the power of a production, and I think directors do, when they are presented with this, do sort of put their thumb on the scales for Bernice, because she does have the power. She's power. Boy Willie's powerless in the face of Sitter's Ghost. Now maybe he had something to do with the live present living Sutter that's left up in the air. But when confronted with the ghost, it's Bernice who has the agency there, not Boy Willie looks helpless.
He says, how I'm going to push a 300-pound man out of the well. But I don't know, to the extent that it's helpful to you, one of the most insightful, one of the best insights I got from anything Wilson said to me was at one point I asked him if he knew the play Home, the Sam R. Williams play, which is an allegory of a black man who comes up in the South. It's kind of an allegory reading of African American history. And he said, no. And he said, it's only about one person, isn't it? Then he talked about meeting Sam R. Williams in the airport. So he knew the play really well, but it's only about one person, and I just kept that in my head every time I reread stuff. The minute you start doing that, I agree with you. I was flabbergasted when he sided with, because I've seen a number of productions of the play, but it's exactly that gets overlooked. The way Avery is looked as a buffoon makes us forget that his exorcism is part of the necessary process. I mean, that's the part I'm suggesting.
Well, yeah, he creates, to the part of, that's about one person. He creates a vivid community which serves as a crucible for a lot of different perspectives. And again, the stronger productions of his work that don't have a particular star in one role, where it's great in simulcast, really emphasize Avery is not the buffoon. He's a little
But there are also fireworks here between African spiritualism and Christianity in those two characters, in the showdown that plays out in the piano lesson. And Wilson tries to be careful not to show his hand, which one he prefers. But not only in the piano lesson, but in other plays as well, he's tilting toward African spiritualism. And so if you read it that way, then Avery does look ineffectual. When he's reading the Bible. And then Boy Willie, if you read it that way, seems to have the upper hand. He's the one that comes and tells him, get your ass out of here, and throws water at him, and actually physically engages. And the scale of things, actually physically engaging is far better than reading words and trying to exercise. So that is what
chain reaction there, where Avery brings Sutter. Sutter brings the yellow dog. He's not just fighting the ghost of Sutter. It's also the yellow dog that's there too. So all of these things require the other one. None of them are sufficient, at least I would read the play that way. And I've seen, as I said, some of the original productions, and I agree with you. You tend to side with Bernice. That's why I was so amazed when I saw his interview.
Well, even just to close that thought, perhaps, and move to our next, even saying that Wilson sided with Boy Willie, we got to be careful. To your point, because we can't put him in that box again, because then he starts to, but what about this side of it? And then he moves into that binary, that opposition again. And so, so that point well taken.
Why didn't he give Boy Willie one line? This ain't any piece of land. This is the piece of land on which we were held in bondage and worked as sharecroppers. Because the land has as much symbolic value as that piano. And why didn't he give him that line? Rhetorical, maybe.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I don't want to, Alan and I don't want to dominate, but I want to commend each of you on your presentations. This is what we mean by new critical perspectives, and especially your paper on the janitor, in terms of going in new directions, those plays that are not often written about, a 4-minute play, no less. So I commend you on the insight that you've had there.
Is the text available somewhere? I never heard of it.
I have.
I know that.
It's in the Bedford anthology.
It's a great teaching text, which is how
So
I
it's out
teach,
there.
you know it.
The new
But I have a
Bedford
few
anthology
copies for
volume
anyone who wants to.
Second edition.
Exactly. And that was an early play, so you get a sense of where his head was
Yes.
in terms of his sensibilities early on.
Can I comment for just a second, unless there's another question about the comments you were making? And not to belabor my paper, but what I find, one of the things I find extraordinarily interesting as I dig into, he's left us, Wilson, such a rich commentary on not only his own plays, but a new theory of drama. It's sort of like Keats's letters, they're personal and then they change what we think forever. And to me, the notion of this contrary or these countervailing characters and positions is really in the situation of Jacob's angel, wrestling with that, which is the way he describes his own dramatic process early, perhaps. And if we remember the context, Jacob is terrified. Jacob is doubtful. Jacob is on the run from his own family. And he goes to sleep and he wrestles with his fears and his doubts and who am I? And when he conquers the angel, he has his new identity, his new name, his integrated self, but he's wounded. He's permanently wounded. And I think I look at these characters and their different, like the interpretation of the families in piano lesson, or the alternate views in radio golf. These are, he's interested in characters who are wrestling. Bernice is not unconflicted.
He's wrestling.
Right, and he's wrestling, but these characters, they are not dogmatic characters. They may present a position, but they're conflicted, wounded, and they're trying to do something about it. I think he admires that resilience to use Sam's word, that, bouncing back to me is sort of can help us reconcile what we might think is contrariness.
Yeah, Troy wrestles with death.
Troy, another good
Boy
example.
Willie wrestles,
Yeah.
Everybody is wrestling.
Yeah,
Sometimes with one
and
another,
that's what gives them
sometimes
part of their
themselves.
stature of dignity, is that
I just want to tease out before I forget, the interview, if you haven't seen it, the Paris Review interview with August Wilson, I think George Clifton, right? I think we have an author on that. You can look that up, it's terrific, so seek that out. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's, the theme of someone feeling in a sense that what they are is what they can sell is, in a way, ubiquitous in American drama. Think of Arthur Miller at the end of Death of a Salesman. Charlie says, the thing we never understood is what he could sell. But I'm wondering whether there's, in August Wilson, a fundamental difference, in the approach to that. Because African Americans are the only ethnic group that actually was legally property. No, there were indentured servants, but only a slave is legally property. And does that give African Americans a different perspective on what property is and how people are defined by their property? And does that then get to the point about the interpersonal self? We all have a story we tell ourselves about who we are. But if that story isn't endorsed by the people we present it to, that story begins to collapse. And there's a lot of American tragedy that's written about that particular collapse. And is there something about the African American experience, the way identity and property come together, that leads to a different perspective on that theme than you get from Arthur Miller, Clifford Odets, whoever else would be addressing that kind of issue?
I don't know, I would say though, when you were speaking about that conflict or the uniqueness of that, I'm thinking of, at the end of Harriet Jacobs' memoir, her autobiography, This Is Like a Slave Girl, where she is, quote, freed by a good Samaritan who buys her freedom, and she won't have it. All right? Because you can't buy something that can't be sold.
Right.
But she acts like a free person. She resists the acceptance of that transaction, but she does accept her freedom. And so I think you're right. I think there is something unique in having the terms in which you are. Yeah.
That was a question brilliantly put. That was a question that I wanted to put to you as well. There needs to be some distinction between the land as property and human beings as property. I mean, that's very rich and powerful and needs to be explored and not suggested that they're on the same level.
You might also want to think about, when you say legally property, how Wilson constantly questions, as you were bringing up, the legality of the law. That is, it is not legal to benefit from anything purchased with stolen goods. It is not legal to sell something that is stolen. You do not legally own it. So the question is, who marks these questions of ownership? And that's problematized, I think, throughout.
This isn't really a question so much as a comment on what he said, which I thought was brilliant. But perhaps also that concept of property gives us another way of understanding Troy Maxon's refusal to let Corey go to college, because Troy can't understand intellectual property. He can understand the paycheck at, was it A&P, I think, where Corey works, but he can't understand the intellectual property of a college education and the capital that it carries with it.
But he also understands the property that he bought with his brother's money. That's property. Gabriel's property.
Any other issues?
Well, regarding, I think it was Henry Louis Gates did a study of successful African Americans in all endeavors, sports, business, law, entertainment, you name it. And he found He was looking for a common denominator. The family, shortly after slavery, owned land. Now, did that bring about family togetherness, a work ethic? Who knows? Or that's just part of the American dream. You own your little house with the white picket fence, that makes you an American.
But as as people migrated from Europe in particular,
Yeah.
the idea was
My
land,
ancestors, yeah.
because that's how it was held over them in Europe. So, and then the promise, you come to the North American continent, there's all of this land. So then that, right, there's that cultural force at play there. Yes.
He is brilliant from Malone High School sophomore, but
These are the best
Oh,
questions.
The screen questions.
well, I just thought it was really, I've only really looked into the piano lesson, thanks to him, but I thought it was really interesting how similar of each argument was, like, with the whole Jews versus African Americans and the catharticism of the piano, like, it's all, like, metaphorical and symbolic, and it all has to do with how you view it as a reader and as a performer. Because I can see how the directors, they'll read it and their opinion and their view will come out through the production. Like, it won't necessarily be the actors think that. So it's all like, it's all based on that, I think. I thought that was interesting.
It's interesting if you get a moment to look up on YouTube the portrayals of Troy Maxson by Denzel Washington and James Earl Jones, and the differences between them, how forceful, particularly James Earl Jones is. And then there are at some points with Denzel delivering lines, the audience laughs, and they wouldn't dare laugh at James Earl Jones saying the same lines. So there's a lot of things at play there, and I'll leave that for
But I think, and thank you for your question. I teach college sophomores for the most part, sophomores and juniors, and this whole notion about the importance of land ownership does not, to this generation, appear to be a conflict. So I spend a lot of time trying to give the historical context so that they would understand and appreciate the conflict in the piano lesson. I think that's something to be grappled with and to understand as well, that at this particular, what Wilson is trying to say is the ownership of land, and Boy Willie says it beautifully in that speech, is raison d'etre at that particular historical juncture, especially when considering many of them were cheated out of their land, or just gave up on it and left the South. So I think the significance of land ownership is a challenge to get contemporary students to understand.
What Willie
See it
says,
as
you
a
can
conflict.
stand up and talk to the white man about the crops or about the weather if you got a piece of land. You can be equal.
So that value has shifted.
I'm not sure. The values are kind of skewed. I'm speaking as another
No,
generation.
I understand. You talk to college sophomores today, they're not in there thinking about, I gotta get some land.
Well, maybe some weed.
Yes.
Well, we've been talking so much about themes and outlooks and all, and sometimes it seems to me that one of the most important elements in Wilson's plays is the language, and the idea. I did a paper conference Sandra arranged a number of years ago on the poetry of August Wilson, and I wondered if people read those poems. Are they, are people generally speaking aware of those poems and how his plays extend that whole idea of the use of poetic images?
Well, where do they exist now? I've spoken with.
I guess
Rich
I'm
Kittle.
asking that too.
Yeah, Rich Kittle
Because I had to
was
dig to find
Marcus'
them.
brother, and he said that there's a bunch of poetry, but.
I've heard that. I've heard that as well.
Right, but then the August Wilson estate has sort of popped above the radar and then went below the radar, and I tried to contact them, and there hasn't been a response. So, does anyone here know?
Well, I found these ones that were published.
Oh, we all say.
Well, there are a
Well,
couple of them.
that's
not
what
a
I'm
whole
asking.
lot of them.
Yeah.
Did you find a collection of them, or?
No, I found them here and there.
Yeah.
Did he rate them for individuals that then they bubble up to the surface then? 'Cause I do have a couple like that that were sent to me over time.
This paper was a number of years ago, and all I remember is that I was just interested in, I'd done this book, that was a bibliographical book about August Wilson, and for the Greenwood Press. And so I encountered them in that, naturally. And, I don't know where I found them, in old magazines, I suppose, or something like that.
I think you said that there are, not only that, there's fiction, there's some fiction also. And where are the August Wilson's paper, where are his papers?
Somebody speculated Yale once.
So where
but
the
I don't
papers
know for
are, I
sure.
would imagine the poems and the fiction would be. But I have not heard anything definitive yet. Have you?
No, was anybody in touch with these things?
No, I've made multiple efforts.
Yeah, there was I gather a big rift between here and Pittsburgh, but I don't know the details.
I tried to contact
I do
somebody.
know this, that when they revived Joe Turner, it had a white director, and she controlled that. And that was very controversial, given the I want a black director. I don't know, I knew immediately when I saw who the director was that there was a rift, and I was told this, but I don't know the details.
I've even tried to contact some newspaper reporters in the Seattle area to see if we could, but nothing has emerged. The two poems that I have, both sent to me, they're gorgeous. You can tell it's August Wilson's language. It's beautiful and delicate and forceful and all of those things. So it would be nice if we could somehow figure out how to push that project forward. Any other questions? Okay, once again, I'd like to thank Michelle.